My guest today is Dr. Helané Wahbeh. Dr. Wahbeh is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. She is also the Assistant Professor of the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Sciences University. She is published in over 90 peer-reviewed journals, which I think is pretty amazing, and also the author of a book called The Science of Channeling, Why You Should Trust Your Intuition and the Science That Connects Us All. Dr. Wahbeh, thank you very much for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Really looking forward to this. I'd like to start this interview off with a bit of information about my background with channeling. I was introduced to it in the late 80s during my early days at the Monroe Institute. And prior to that, I had no experience. I came across a lot of very normal people doing extraordinary things. And my experience was with trance channelers, which I've always considered to be somewhat different than the psychics I've run into, in that they allow some other entity to embody them for a time. And I thought this whole experience was fascinating, but a bit eerie at the time anyway. And I think a lot of people only know about this aspect of the channeling phenomenon. So my first question to you is, are most of the people that you're observing in your research doing this sort of trance channeling?
I have a special interest in trance channeling because my mother is a trance channeler, my grandmother was a trance channeler. I have multiple people in my family who experience trance channeling. And so I have a personal interest to it, and that's part of what I bring to my research interests and background. Mm-hmm. That being said, trance channeling, I would call a more rare form of a larger umbrella of channeling. So I have a unique definition of the word channeling, which is this process of expressing, receiving information and energy from beyond our conventional notions of time and space, and that these channeling experiences exist on a spectrum. And so trance channeling is just one type of the broader channeling experiences, like you mentioned, things like ESP or psychic experiences, etc. I would not consider trance channeling, right, but I would consider it channeling. So like you mentioned, trance channeling is quite unique as an observer and doing it yourself. I've actually received some training to learn how to do it. So the experience of trance channeling is quite fascinating. And so there are so many nuances that we can really get into about trance channeling, but I'll just stop there and see if you have any questions about what I just shared.
There are a lot of nuances in this whole conversation, as far as I'm concerned, with regards to how people are doing this, and what it is that they're reading, where projection and transference may come into it. I mean, we could talk for hours, but I know your time is limited. So let's try and define the difference between a trance channeler and a psychic.
Sure. So you alluded to the trance channeling a little bit. So trance channelers believe that their body is essentially used as a vehicle for an apparent non-physical being to speak through, to move through. Essentially, their body acts as a communication or movement device for these supposed non-physical beings. People experience some level of trance. Either they're completely in trance and they don't remember the trance channeling sessions at all. Right. So to them, it feels like they fall asleep, then they wake up and people tell them what happened in the session. Other people, and this is more common nowadays, there's this description of feeling like they're stepping aside or moving over, and the supposed non-physical being is speaking through them, and they witness it. They observe themselves speaking, even though they have no idea what they're about to say. They're essentially watching themselves trance channeling, if you will.
Is it sort of like an out-of-body experience for them?
Although their frame of reference is still within the body. So for the most part, it's not like they're hovering above or in a different space, they're still, it's like they're coexisting within the same body, but they have given over the driver's seat of the body. Yeah. So that's very different from what people might understand as psychic. And, that can include any number of experiences, clairvoyance, being able to see things that you may not be able to see with your visual sight or your five senses, feeling things in your body, being able to feel the future, like presentiment, precognition, knowing the future, being able to use your intention to affect the physical world, like psychokinesis. I think in general, psychic usually refers to people's receptive experiences or phenomenon of, somehow receiving information or energy or something from beyond our traditional five senses.
Using some method of non-locality in terms of information floating around. Both are fascinating. So you have a background in anthropology and a clinical doctorate in natural medicine. You're a professor of neurology, which defines consciousness in terms of brain activity, as I understand it. I'm fascinated to know how a neurologist became interested in the phenomenon of channeling. You said you grew up with this. Is that what sparked your desire to research it, to try to understand it from a different point of view?
Yes, my path to where I am right now is quite fascinating and full of synchronicities. I do want to clarify, though, that I'm not trained as a neurologist. Like you mentioned, I am trained as a naturopathic physician, so I have a clinical background and a clinical research background. So I have a master's in clinical research, have done multiple postdoctoral fellowships in clinical research. The unique way I ended up in the neurology department at Oregon Health and Science University was because they had a postdoctoral fellowship on complementary and alternative medicine. So I completed a postdoctoral fellowship within that program that was housed in the Department of Neurology. So that's why I have an appointment in neurology, although I am not officially a neurologist.
Got it.
And you're absolutely right. Neuroscience today is very focused on materialistic explanations of consciousness, that our consciousness is a product of our neurons, of our physical brain. And that doesn't really line up with these phenomenon that we experience through psi or channeling, etc.
So you've been doing studies of this phenomenon from a genetic perspective, as I understand it. And you've been looking for clues in the genes of people who are particularly talented as psychics or channelers. Tell us what you found.
So the reason I wanted to look into that ties back into your question about how did I end up doing what I'm doing right now. So, when I was 10 years old, I went to my first spiritualist-like meeting at my grandparents' house and was really steeped in a spiritualist type tradition through my upbringing, which really affected me profoundly. And yet career-wise, I didn't feel safe talking about this, and I couldn't really feel like I could, research it or talk about it at my lab meetings in any way. And so when I was invited, I did quite a bit of meditation research. So that was my niche at Oregon Health and Science University. And I was invited to come to the Institute of Noetic Sciences for an expert meditation researcher event where we were talking about the future of meditation and what was missing from the Western studies looking at meditation, which at that point was seeing a huge increase in research studies. So that's how I found out about ions, and through this beautiful chain of events ended up on staff and then director of research. And so now at ions, I have the freedom to be able to ask the research questions about channeling that I'm personally interested in. And so building on the work that IONS had already done, and of course the work of others, I developed a program called the IONS Channeling Research Program that was focused on 6 important questions. What do we already know? How common is it? What makes a channeler a channel? Mm-hmm. How does it work? Is the content useful? And so that question about what makes a channeler is where the genetics come in, coming back to your original question. Right. So obviously this ran in my family. There's many, many anecdotes about people saying that these psychic channeling abilities run in families. Mm-hmm. And there have been also a few formal studies, survey studies, and pedigree study looking at this. So we were curious to test if this was true, then perhaps we would see some differences in the genetics if we looked at people who had high functioning psychic abilities and people who didn't. So thus far, we've run one small pilot case control study, and we found something quite fascinating. We found a difference between the high functioning psychics and the controls on a non-coding region of the DNA. They used to call this junk DNA, right, but now it's called non-coding because it doesn't directly code for protein, but it influences it in ways that we're learning a lot more about right now. And this was on chromosome 7 on something called the TNRC portion, near the TNRC portion, which is highly expressed in the body, but especially in the brain. So this was quite fascinating. And we definitely want to do more work to attempt to replicate this. What inspired us to think that maybe this wasn't just some spurious finding was we also looked at a large genomic data sets for the expression of this specific region that we found. And what we found is that it's actually was in the original wild type form in the psychics, and that the controls had a mutation of this specific area, and that the mutation was related to the spread of Christianity. And you can imagine why the spread of Christianity would select for people to not have psychic abilities because of the, witch trials and Inquisition, etc.
Right.
So that was quite fascinating. And we also found an association between the mutation and technology. So envision that perhaps these psychic abilities have some evolutionary advantage because you could tune into where the buffalo are or some other,
right,
benefits. And so the more technologically advanced we became, the less you would need that, and it would be mutated out. So we saw a relationship there as well. So that got us excited that it wasn't just some random result that we found, and perhaps there's something there. And we're actively trying to raise funding so we can do a replication study and see if it bears out in a larger sample.
Well, as a pilot study, I'd say that's some pretty amazing stuff right there. And I hope you get the funds to have it replicated. So there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. And I'd like to go down that rabbit hole a little bit, if you don't mind. How many people did you have in this study to begin with?
There were 14 psychics and 10 controls. One of the psychics the sample wasn't great, so we ended up with 13 and 10.
Mm-hmm. But these were all talented psychics and had been vetted, I assume, from the get-go.
Yes, they went through multiple layers of vetting, interviews, remote viewing tasks, online tasks, recommendations from other people. So they went through a pretty stringent process.
Right. So you're not just talking about trance channelers at all. These are just psychics in general.
That's right.
And the predominant It was predominantly a genetic study, and I'm kind of blown away by this whole chromosome 7 non-coding thing because I'm not a geneticist, and I'd like to try to put that into a language that everybody who is not a geneticist like me can easily understand. But my understanding of what you just said was that the expression of the chromosome 7 is apparently happening in the brain in those who are talented subjects. Do I have that correct?
Say that again?
It's expressed in the brain. Chromosomes are this wild gene that seems to be inherent in all of humanity was expressing in the brain of those who are talented subjects. Did I understand that correctly?
Almost. So what we don't know if this is true specifically of our specific participants, but in general, what we know about this region of the non-coding DNA is that it's highly expressed in the brain.
Okay.
So previous studies that have looked at this find that the protein that's next to this non-coding region is highly expressed in the brain.
There's something unique about these people from a genetic perspective. But it's not so unique that it's not inherent in all of us, is my understanding of it.
That's right. It's the wild type. It's the dominant expression of this non-coding gene.
That gives me so much hope.
It does. And it's aligned with my hypothesis that all humans have the capacity for this intuitive noetic wisdom. And that it just shows up in different ways for them. So maybe these high functioning psychics are practiced at it or have some other environmental or natural factors that allow them to be quite skilled at it, where other people may not have those factors or didn't train it, or who knows. There's so many questions that we want to explore around this now as well.
Or perhaps they'd never shut it down, is what I'm hearing also, because you said that there was a correlation between the rise of Christianity and the suppression of this ability, which should be inherent in all of us. Did I hear that correctly?
It's essentially a mutation. So the mutation was selected for. So envision you have 100 people, right? And, we're in the Middle Ages, and 50 of them have really strong psychic abilities and unfortunately are put to death, right?
Sure.
So the people who survive this is such a very general example here, but the people who survive have a mutation that prevents them from expressing their psychic abilities. And they're the ones who survive and have children, etc.
Right.
So that's just one very speculative explanation for the result that we found in this pilot study.
But I think one of the things I'm a little curious about, because it seems to me that part of this suppression, rather than expression, of this particularly normal, we might call it, or inherent part of humanity is, taken away from us. I'm wondering about what it is about Christianity that in any way, changed that. Because I can understand, for instance, being, raised in a, shall we call it, an esoterically bent family, where it was part of your normal life to go through this and it had a great impact on you. But simultaneously, you knew that not everybody in your circle of friends found this to be normal. I know in my world, it wouldn't have been considered normal growing up. But I'm thinking about Christianity, and Christianity, from my understanding of it anyway, has a long tradition in terms of psychic phenomenon, at least as I understand it. The prophets were everywhere, weren't they? I mean, people still speak in tongues and do all sorts of unique things that somebody outside or uninitiated into the mysteries of Christianity might find that to be strange and unusual. So do you think it was a Christian thing that took this out of our genetic makeup, or at least our ability to express it? Or do you think are other factors that perhaps created this suppression? I don't know what else to call it other than a suppression.
Sure. I would say that the short answer is I don't know. I mean, this is all speculation, right? But, if you look at it on an individual level. Like someone being Christian today is not going to suppress their psychic ability, if that's what you think I'm saying, which is totally not what I'm saying. The analysis that we found had to do with the length of time that the country was Christian, which we believe has to do with these extreme persecutions that resulted in death and the lack of having children in the people who had this wild type psychic abilities, and the survival of people who didn't. So this is like, historically, people who had a strong expression of psychic abilities were killed, right? They were persecuted and killed.
Right.
Like that's not happening today, but there was many, many centuries and generations of our human history where that was a common practice. And so that's essentially where we are speculating this relationship probably came from, rather than someone today being Christian. That's not going to change their genetics, right? Because they aren't being killed off and not having children. You see what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Certainly. The
Okay.
Spanish
Does that help clarify a little bit?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I was just wondering. I guess it might have had more to do with I won't call it the Spanish Inquisition and the real, the Malleus.
Witch trials,
exactly.
Inquisition, there was a very dark, unfortunately, very long time of history where people who express psychic abilities were killed.
Right. And I think to some degree, too, that there may still be that tradition is alive. And in other words, if it's happening outside of your culture, it's not cool. But if it's happening inside your culture, it's a gift from God, sort of thing. Strange. But I don't think that we're outside of the realm of science here. That made my ears perk up and go, I wonder what that's all about. Anyway, I understood that you also did a lot of EEG readings on these subjects. How many channels were you using?
We actually didn't do EEG in this study.
Oh, okay.
We did EEG in a trance channeling study. That was a different study. So we did do EEG on trance channelers that were going in and out of trance state.
I see. Well, I have a real fondness for reverse engineering EEG information of people who are in altered states of consciousness. So I thought we'd go down that road a little bit, if you don't mind talking about that.
Sure.
What did you find with regards to folks who are in the trance channeling state with regards to their brainwaves? What did you discover? Were there any correlations?
Fascinatingly, in the standard frequency analysis, which is looking at alpha band, alpha, theta, gamma, delta, etc., we did not see any differences between the trance state and the non-trance state. And so just to give a little more background on what these trance channelers were doing, they would come to our lab, we'd hook them up to EEG, EKG, skin conductance, blood pressure, etc. And then they would go into a trance state for 5 minutes. Then they would go out of a trance state. The non-trance state, we asked them to think about a grocery list, to envision themselves gardening in their garden, these various, non-channeling tasks so that their mind would be busy and would not go into a trance state. And they alternated 3 times. And then we did that on 2 days. And when we looked at the EEG data of the channeling states versus the non-channeling states, we saw no difference in the EEG. And this was quite surprising to us because there had been some previous studies that did show a difference. And then when you observe trance channelers, they are markedly different. Their voice, their mannerisms, etc. Because we are collecting EEG, we asked the trance channelers to be still and silent.
Right.
And there was definitely pushback because they're like, well, I don't do that. Like, to me, channeling is when I talk, And so really, we were testing this experience that we'd call incorporation. So essentially they would, go through their process of inviting this supposed non-physical being into their body, but they wouldn't speak. And so that's what we were looking at. Now, that study was a few years ago, and we finally had a chance to do some more complex EEG analysis. And we've just finished that analysis now, looking at something called interconnectivity. So it's basically the correlation between the various channels, EEG channels. And with that analysis, we did see differences between the channeling state and the non-channeling state. So the direct band frequencies showed no difference. But when we looked at how the brain was communicating to the different parts of the brain, there was a difference between the channeling and the non-channeling. And we're working on writing that up right now.
I totally understand it. And, these studies, they have to be done slowly and methodically, and you have to question everything. And I applaud you for doing it at all, quite frankly. During your studies, you managed to create several classifications of what we'll call psychic flow of information. You define these as noetic signatures, as being a state of knowing, a direct hit, a direct knowing, that sort of thing. Clairaudience, clairsentience. What have you noticed as being a dominant source of information?
You brought up a really great point. When you hear about this experience that I'm calling channeling, there's so many different terms.
Right.
And, these terms have been around for over 100 years now. I mean, parapsychology has been looking at this for 150 years now. And you mentioned a few of those common terms, right?
Right.
So this noetic signature project was my attempt to start from scratch, from people's felt experience of these phenomenon, and to try to build up from there. So, hey, let's just let go of the boxes of these terms.
Right.
And what do people actually experience? So we did a large qualitative study with over 500 people where they wrote out what they experienced. Then we did a qualitative analysis, pulled out themes, and created a questionnaire called the Noetic Signature Inventory that allows people to see where their characteristics of their noetic expression. And you mentioned a few of them. And just to let the listeners know, this study is now live again. So if people want to take the Noetic Signature Inventory, they can go to our Participate in Research website and take the inventory, and we'll send them a report so that they can see where their scores lie on these 12 different characteristics. The most common of these 12 is what you might call general intuition. I just know it. I just feel it.
Right.
It's this generalized intuition that most people say that they've had at some point in their life, what someone might call a gut hunch, or, just a feeling, or just a knowing of something being true, or a decision that they need to make. That is the most common. The second noetic signature characteristic is what we call embodied sensations. So I'm really strong in this. I get goosebumps. So if I feel something is truth, I get goosebumps all over my body. And to me, that's a signal that I should follow that path. Other people get tingling or a zinging or a dizziness, and that's how they know that they're receiving noetic information. Other people get literally physical sensations from other people. So let's say you're in the room with someone, that other person has a headache, and then all of a sudden you end up with a headache. So you're literally picking up people's physical sensations. It's called telesomatic. And Larry Dossey wrote a few papers on this experience. It's not as common, but that's different than getting the goosebumps as a general indicator of noetic signature. And it's different from a gut hunch where you just feel something in your belly. Mm-hmm. Another one that's related to the body is inner knowing through touch. So some people can hold an object in their hand and receive a great deal of information about it that they wouldn't normally know through their five senses, like who owned it and what they did with it, etc. One that's perhaps more commonly understood is inner voice or clairaudience, or having, hearing words of wisdom or direction, or stop, don't go through the stoplight, etc.
Or keep your mouth shut.
Yeah.
That one comes to me all the time.
Right. The next one is apparent communication with non-physical beings. So that refers to mediumship and trance channeling. The next one is knowing the future or precognition. Mm-hmm. The next one is knowing others' minds. So that's, traditionally called telepathy. Mm-hmm. There is a whole separate category called knowing through dreams, which I found quite interesting, because what that means to me is that there's some people who are more apt to get their noetic wisdom during their sleeping state than their waking state. Mm-hmm. So that was another characteristic.
There's an old Talmudic phrase that says, a dream uninterpreted is like a letter from God unopened.
Oh, okay. Yes, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Then there's also knowing yourself as another characteristic. What we found through the statistics was that there was an aspect of people practically using this in their daily life that was an actual separate characteristic, which is quite fascinating. The next one was visualizing or to access or affect. So this includes manifestation. Mm-hmm. So intending for something to happen. It includes psychokinesis, healing intention, and it also includes remote viewing. Mm-hmm. So being able to see a far distant object. Mm-hmm. The next one's actually healing, and that's the last one, and that would include energy medicine, Reiki, mm-hmm. healing through intention, etc. So that got pulled apart as a separate factor as well. So those are the 12 different characteristics that make up the noetic signature as we found through our research program.
And I'm quite familiar with things like that. Your book is subtitled Why You Should Trust Your Intuition, which, doesn't mean that you're going to be a trance channeler. And I'm just trying to ease into this openness that everybody listening can kind of get a sense that, you're not entirely crazy if you're picking up information that doesn't have an actual source or an apparent source.
In fact, the experience is incredibly common. I mean, we've done so many different studies now, and people from all over the world have looked at this, at how common these experiences are, mm-hmm. and they're highly prevalent.
It's true. My dad was a New York City cop. And like all cops in his generation, they use their gut instincts, quote unquote, to get information about their surroundings. And one might call that a state of hypervigilance. For some it is, perhaps. But in the case of my dad and his contemporaries who were trained to be calm and yet hyper-aware, or acutely aware, we might call it, it's a different type of thing than, say, hypervigilance. But I'm interested to know, have you seen any evidence to suggest that hypervigilance is correlated to the accuracy of a psychic?
That's a great question. What's fascinating is there's this relationship that people have seen between trauma mm-hmm. as a child mm-hmm. and psychic abilities. And again, if you think about that evolutionarily, when people experience trauma, they go into a hypervigilant state to either prevent or protect themselves in case that stimulus comes at them again. And so there is this heightened state of awareness. Now, could that awareness extend beyond our five senses? I personally believe that it can. Mm-hmm. And thus, they become more psychic. They start having, getting more information than their five senses have previously supplied. Could this be trained outside of trauma? There's many teachers who believe that it can. People who train remote viewing, who train psychokinesis, who train just general psychic abilities, believe that people can learn how to do this. So they may not all be, the NBA basketball players of psychic ability, but that anyone who has the intent to learn can learn it to some capacity.
You're looking at one of them. Charlie Tart once told me a long time ago, with regards to psi experiments, if you want to see success, the first question is to how to train that person to do it.
Right.
It's the only way to get it going, because a lot of it has to do with trust, and trust isn't necessarily something a lot of people can do with regards to their own intuition, which gets into the whole construct of, projection, transference. How do I know what I'm thinking is absolutely true? And then there's an arrogance on the other side of the coin, right? Where people think, I'm getting this impression that you are doing this, that, and the other thing, and my clairgnosis is never wrong, sort of thing,
Right.
So it's a balancing act. One of the things I've noticed also throughout the years is that empathy can sometimes be a cause of suffering in psychics. Meaning it's mostly having to do with psychic healers. I don't know if you've done work in this realm, but people involved in doing psychic healing are often plagued with various forms of systemic health issues. The wounded healer type of archetype. Have you ever done any research on this? And I guess the real question I want to ask is, are boundaries something which need to be observed, in your opinion, when doing any of this type of work?
Yes, that's a great question. I can't speak to it from a research perspective because I've never done any formal studies on this. I do personally have experience with this, and I've heard so many stories coming in about this phenomenon that you're speaking of loose boundaries, if you will, of the healer, the empath, picking up on other people's energies, of people who don't have training or tools, walking through crowds, and then they fall over at the end because they've just picked up everyone's emotions or physical sensations, etc. So I think it is a real issue. And I would love to do some studies on that, but my plate's quite full, and so I will eventually, but not at the moment. And I personally use very specific tools to support my body and my nervous system to cope with that inflow of emotional, and I don't want to call it outside energy because I believe we're all interconnected, but energy that isn't specifically mine in this moment, if you will. And I talk about that in my book, actually. There's a whole chapter that talking about tools, and I include those practices in there for people who have that experience. Because my personal experience is that this is a real phenomenon, and that it can influence people's health in a negative way. And then there's fear that arises because people say, oh, I don't want to, I don't want this because it's overwhelming and it's scary and I don't feel good. And when they're offered tools that can support them to maintain their sensitivity and to learn how to turn it up and turn it down based on the situation, it helps improve their health and their outlook on life because of that.
Yes, absolutely. And actually probably makes them a bit better in terms of their accuracy. They tend to learn what's theirs, what's not theirs by knowing where they begin and end in the flow of the subject-object split, for instance.
Right. So, for example, let's say someone takes the noetic signature inventory and they score really high on that emotional characteristic, then they could be provided with tools that could support them to navigate in their world. For example, crowds is such a common and big things. So someone who scores high on that empathetic characteristic, if they just walk into a crowd without clear intention, it's going to negatively affect their system.
Sure.
But there's very simple tools that you can do before going into a crowd to help prevent that. And so having that awareness can help people take steps to support themselves in that way. So going back to the accuracy piece, though, because you mentioned that a couple times and I didn't address it. It is a big red flag to me if someone says they're accurate 100% of the time. I just don't think that's possible. And I think it is a misconception of the general public to think that psychics can actually do that. Psychics or mediums or anyone that can be accurate 100% of the time. It's not 100% accurate skill set at all. And that filter supports people to appreciate it, I think, more and use it as a tool in their life. I mean, what is really 100% sure in our life, really,
Right. Yeah,
So, and related to that is this phenomenon of people projecting their authority onto psychic, mediumistic, channeled information without discernment. And they just say, oh, it was channeled. It must be real and true. And I have to incorporate all of it into my life. I mean, why? Like, the whole mom saying, well, if your friend told you to jump off the cliff, would you? I mean, we have to bring our same discernment to any information that's coming in, whether it's coming from me or someone else. And, we have layers of ego that this information filters through that can influence what comes through. So if I'm emotional about or attached about an outcome, I can't get a clear result on my tuning in about it. I know this about myself,
Everything you just said, amen. I wanted to somebody else to say it because I've been preaching it from the mountaintops for a very, very long time here. And, it's people want to believe.
Yeah.
And I too know that the power of that belief system. I know what it does for one's overview, their perspective in life, their own potential unfolding. I love all of that. Simultaneously, psi research is a very real branch of science, which is not being taken seriously by other branches of sciences because of this misconception in the belief structure of the population in general.
Right.
And it's something that I think needs to be corrected. And I'm very glad to hear you say it. So I've been aware of psi research for quite some time now. I'm long in the tooth. And I spoke with Edgar Mitchell, and I mentioned Charles Tarton. I'm sure you know of his work, right? But I spoke with Ed Mitchell years ago about the mechanism behind what it was that enabled people to transmit or receive this information, the spooky action at a distance kind of thing. And at the time, Ed's model was the quantum hologram, that it was a hologram that we live in, that information was transferred through the waves, perhaps, in the particle wave interaction in an atom. Is that still the current model at Noetics?
We don't necessarily use that term, but I think it's still pretty similar in that consciousness is fundamental and is non-local.
Well, you just said a mouthful there, didn't you? You want to talk about consciousness? You want to talk about the mystery of consciousness?
That's what we're talking about, essentially, right?
Yeah,
so we already mentioned that consciousness, according to neuroscience, is limited to the physical brain, right? But we have, in my opinion, growing evidence that our consciousness is non-local, that it extends beyond the brain. And we see this in many, many different types of cases. And so the idea that our consciousness is housed and limited to our brain, to me, is just seems impossible, And
And yet we all have these experiences of personal consciousness rather than in the impersonal sea in which we swim, to quote Joseph Campbell.
Yeah. There's multiple theorists now who are proposing consciousness as fundamental theories. And what does that mean? It means that consciousness is the grounded nature of reality, and our experiences arise from that. Take, for example, Bernardo Kastrup. He has something called analytic idealism. And, consciousness is fundamental. And my experience of Helane is a small dissociated consciousness from the larger consciousness. So my piece of consciousness is just a little dissociated part that can experience itself as separate, but in the grounded reality isn't separate. I just have this dissociative boundary that lets me feel that I am.
And that boundary may play an important part on the mystical phrase of you are the subtle underlying cause of the entire universe, in terms of it being a sort of biofeedback learning loop for the universe to experience itself. Maybe.
Yes, maybe. And that aligns with Thomas Campbell's consciousness is fundamental theory, my big toe, my big theory of everything. And that's the primary motivation / assumption is learning, and, Thomas Campbell studied with Monroe quite a bit. So that's another interesting theory. There's many theories: Federico Fagin, Donald Hoffman, Bernard Carr, Jude Currivan. I mean, there's many, many different, very bright, much smarter than people who are thinking about various theories around consciousness being fundamental and how we arose from that.
Many of which echoing wisdom that was been around for thousands of years and just now only being understood in the light of quantum science, current psychological theory, depth psychology. It's fascinating. Yeah. Let's talk about your book, The Science of Channeling, the subtitle being Trusting Your Inner Intuition. How does somebody who makes mistakes in their life, and we all make mistakes, you fall in love with the wrong person, for instance, and you thought they were your soulmate, but everything about this person showed me we were meant to be together, something I knew inherently. How does somebody who uses intuition to make a decision and then experience trauma learn to trust their intuition? It seems to me life throws a lot of curveballs to us that create problems with intuitive quadrants and developing them and trusting those intuitive quadrants. Does your book give any insights about that and what to do about that?
That's a doozy of a question.
Do you want to bypass it and go on to something else?
It's a great question, and it's the most perfect question because it's what we face every day. And I do talk a lot about decision making and using our intuitive capacity to support our decisions. And, when people first start out with this, they almost always ask, but how do I know? How can I trust? How can I not be in doubt about the decisions I'm tuning in about? And my recommendations are to first start small. Start with small decisions. Should I eat this food or that food? What does that feel like? How does my noetic signature show up for me? How do I nurture and strengthen that? How do I practice daily with very small, inconsequential decisions to build my intuitive muscle? It's like talking about attention training in meditation. It literally is like a muscle. You have to practice. You have to build it up. And slowly, you start learning, okay, this is totally coming from my ego, or no, this feels very clear. And there's also in between where it can be mixed. Rarely is it such a clear black and white dichotomy. And then let's say you get the insight and you're like, okay, this feels like I should choose B, right? Then you choose B, and then it's easy and it opens up and some other opportunity shows up because you followed B, right? And you're like, okay, this is likely the right path. I'm going to follow this path until I'm hitting a wall. So let's say you chose A. It's difficult. It's hard. It's not working. I'm banging my head against the wall, but my ego really wants it. So I'm going to keep going down A. That's likely not the right discernment in that moment. That's just very practical advice for beginning this intuitive process in decision making. That's very different from the example you started with about, hey, I just went through this breakup, and you alluded to the idea that being with this person was a mistake. But my recommendation for that person would be to really sit with, was it really a mistake? What learnings did you gain from that relationship? What did that relationship offer you? How are you a different person now than you were 3 years ago when you first met that person? And can you glean as much wisdom as you can from the letting go, and then to let go with grace and be like, this is now in this moment, this relationship is over. Not that I made a mistake,
right,
but that it was what it was. And now it's going to be something different. And that's okay. And to trust my own internal knowing about the process of me being okay and learning what the next best step is for me.
Very well said. Like a mindful approach of a life practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that my guidance is deeply influenced by mindfulness just because of my meditation training and mindfulness training and practice, etc.
Right. That's something we share in common. We both teach meditation, and we both know why it's important. So you're a mindfulness teacher, and I believe that's a highly important method. I've taken the approach of exploring not only the conscious mind and mindfulness, but I also have a deep love and appreciation for the hypnagogic state and how it can be explored and integrated. Integrating the content of that state of consciousness can be immensely beneficial. And I'm wondering if you think there's a value in exploring altered states of consciousness and what that might do to one's intuition.
I personally love altered states of consciousness.
Okay, so I'll take that as a yes.
Yes. And my personal experience and hearing from others, and also my research, when people are able to access transcendent samadhi, oneness, whatever you want to term you want to apply to it, but that state that is bigger than the personal self, I find that it triggers in them an awakening because there is a visceral truth that, oh, wow, I am more than this body, and I want to know what that's all about. So I find it extremely beneficial for people to do that. And there have been numerous studies showing that that is so, that people, have improved quality of life, transformational experiences, increased meaning in life from various paths to those altered states, whether it's psychedelics or binaural beats or sound technology or meditation or drumming or shamanistic traditions. There's so many different paths and ways to engage in this altered state of consciousness that extends us beyond the personal self, beyond our five senses, into the larger whole, the larger oneness.
I could go on and on and on with my personal experience, but I too am obviously a fan. So I know that you're an ND, and my wife is a holistic healthcare practitioner. I know quite a lot about it. And I'm also guessing that you have a real respect for psychoneuroimmunology.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm not making this up as I go along. So body-mind medicine and the like, it's been around for quite some time. You mentioned you were part of the NIH studies. I'm assuming that was the CSCAT studies? Center
It
for
was called Vet Mind. Then at the time, it was called the National Center for Complementary and Alternative
Right,
Medicine.
right.
They've now
CSCAT, right,
changed their name to NSIM.
right,
And NSIM, yeah.
right. So what happened to that? Is that still in existence?
My specific study was a 5-year study that I completed and wrote up, and it's now complete. So that was with combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And we taught them mindfulness meditation and looked at how mindfulness could potentially improve their post-traumatic stress disorder
Mm-hmm.
symptoms, and specifically looking at how mindfulness works.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a fascinating study because while we found that their PTSD symptoms themselves
Mm-hmm.
didn't necessarily change from the intervention, their relationship to them shifted.
Yes.
So, they might still have a hyperarousal or a flashback, etc., whereas before they'd beat themselves up and get angry and upset. After they learned the mindfulness, they're like, okay, there it is again. And I'm not going to freak out, and I'm just going to let it ride through and be done. The power of the mind, you mentioned the mind and the body and psychoneuroimmunology. The mind is incredibly powerful. You hear about some studies and they say, oh, it's just the placebo effect.
Mm-hmm.
Just the placebo effect is
word.
actually an incredibly strong factor.
Mm-hmm.
And if you step back and say, oh, well, that's actually the power of the mind influencing the body.
Mm-hmm.
How do we maximize the placebo effect and bring awareness and intention to how our mental influences our physical health?
I'm a firm believer in mind-body connection. I've seen the results in my personal life, like you. Been meditating for a very, very, very long time, long in the tooth. Prior to December of 2019 was probably the first time in about 20 years that I had gotten sick. And I've avoided surgery using meditation. I'm a firm believer. I want to give people hope out there. The mind-body connection, the exploration of consciousness, the exploration of intuition, and learning to trust your intuition. All of these are functions of consciousness, and they need to be supported in whatever way possible. For those who know nothing about the Institute of Noetic Science and want to participate in all of this wisdom and knowledge that's available out there, give our audience a sampling of what's being done there and how they can participate.
So the Institute of Noetic Sciences is actually turning 50 years old, which is incredible. It was founded in 1973 by Edgar Mitchell, who was an Apollo 14 astronaut and the 6th person to walk on the moon. Mm-hmm. And he was inspired to create IONS, which is the acronym for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, because of his transcendent experience coming home from the moon to Earth. Mm-hmm. And so today, IONS is focused on what we call the noetic handshake, which is the synergy between direct experience and science. Mm-hmm. So as the director of research, I head up the science department. We're focused on many different studies, looking at channeling, looking at these various phenomenon, looking at transformative practices, which we do through the IONS Discovery Lab. So if you're a workshop leader of a transformative practice, you can be part of our IONS Discovery Lab study. Mm-hmm. We do surveys before and after your workshop and then send you a report. Mm-hmm. That's one of our main research programs right now. We also have what we call IONS X, which is about how our consciousness affects the physical world. So we have a number of studies looking at intention and how intention can influence various targets. Mm-hmm. What is it about the person directing the intention that makes that stronger or weaker? Are there any analysis techniques or moderators that influence the relationship between what we call the operator and the target? And learning how to maximize that intention effect. So that's the second research program. And then, of course, we still have the IONS channeling research program, which is continuing a number of various projects, including a reinvigoration of physical mediumship. We're hosting a symposium at the end of May to support physical mediumship research and scholarship. So that's the science department. I can't get into all the projects, but you can learn more about these projects, our peer-reviewed papers that we've published on our website, www.noetic.org. There you can also learn about our experience department that has regular webinars every Friday. Those are no cost, and you can join our community, get the benefits of our newsletters, our blogs, our science alerts about the research we're doing, and become involved in a thriving community.
You're going to get bombarded. Never enough subjects, right?
Yeah.
I think it's great. Yeah, I know you're going to get an email request from me. There are plenty of things I'd love to be involved in. Dr. Wahbeh, I think all of you wonderful scientists are not only brave and inquisitive and true explorers. I totally admire your courage and appreciate you so much for being open to the possibilities, the human potential, and for being a part of this fascinating conversation surrounding consciousness. I thought you brought a very unique perspective. And thank you so much for joining in on this conversation, for your time today. Truly, deeply appreciated.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. So wonderful to share this exciting information with all of you. And I hope you will join us as we move down this road of discovery of consciousness and how to support ourselves to step into that and not only help ourselves personally, but our communities and ultimately humanity.
I couldn't agree with you more. We're at a bifurcation point, and now's the time to step up to the plate and learn all about the self with the small s and the self with the capital S, right?
That's right. Thank you.
Dr. Wahbeh, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you.
You're welcome.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.